In this video, I'll discuss what is the hierarchy of evidence, how to make evidence-informed decisions. I'll explain the evidence hierarchy, what it is, why it matters, and how you can use it to help you make decisions. Many of you are seasoned leadership practitioners entering the research arena and may be thinking, I know my context inside out. Why should I bother with an abstract hierarchy of evidence? Because that hierarchy of evidence is your practical guide when you sift through studies for your literature review. The hierarchy of evidence helps you judge the quality of each claim before you cite it in your own academic writing. By the end of this video, I hope you'll be able to see that evidence-informed decision-making is more than just a buzzword. It's a disciplined way to separate trustworthy scientific evidence from attention-grabbing anecdotes. It helps you ground your decision-making and your research in the best available knowledge and evidence while still honoring local context and lived experiences. The term hierarchy of evidence refers to the idea that not all evidence is created equal. Some research designs yield more trustworthy knowledge than others. In evidence-based practice, this term is often visualized as a pyramid, ranking research types from most to least rigorous. This ranking is grounded in the assumption that certain methods, experiments, systematic reviews better protect against the bias and thereby yielding conclusions that are more reliable and broadly applicable. A hierarchy orders studies by their internal validity. Methods less prone to biases, like well-run experiments, rank above those more susceptible to error and bias. The hierarchy of evidence is also a weighting scheme. A large randomized control study or meta-analysis carries more evidential weight than, say, a single expert's opinion. However, as we will learn in this video, hierarchy is only one dimension. Two other important dimensions are quality and the relevance of evidence. A common understanding is to equate the level of evidence where it lies in the hierarchy of evidence with its actual quality or its applicability to a question. Let me clarify those three terms before moving on. Hierarchy of evidence, as I've already discussed, is a ranking order of evidence types by research design. It's about the potential strength of evidence if it is done well. For example, a randomized control trial, also known as RCT, is higher in the hierarchy than a single case study because a randomized control trial by design have less biases. Hierarchy of evidence tells us which form of evidence is generally more trustworthy, assuming ideal conditions. Quality of evidence refers to how well a particular study was conducted, regardless of its type. Not all randomized control trials are automatically high quality. A poor executed RCT with design flaws, biases, too small a sample may actually provide weaker evidence than well-conducted observational study. Quality is evaluated by looking at methodological rigor. Was the study design appropriate? Did it have adequate sample size? Were the measurements valid and reliable? Did the researchers avoid or account for biases? For example, the GRADE approach, which stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluations in Healthcare, explicitly rates evidence quality as high, moderate, low, very low by examining risk of bias, consistency of results, and precision, rather than relying only on the study type. So hierarchy is about a method's potential. Quality is about the execution of your research method. A high-level evidence type can be done poorly, and lower-level type can be done exceptionally well. Relevance of evidence is about applicability to the specific context or question at hand. Evidence that is strong in general may not be relevant to your specific organizational context or population. For example, a meta-analysis of large organizations may not be directly relevant to a small organization, or a leadership practice proven effective in one country may not translate to another country with different cultural conditions. Relevance focuses on, does this evidence apply here, now, for my purpose? It includes external validity, which is generalizability, and contextual fit. An evidence source may be high on the hierarchy and of high quality, but if it addresses a different problem or a different kind of population than the one you are dealing with, its usefulness and applicability are very limited. Sometimes a lower hierarchy, moderate quality study that was done in a setting very similar to yours can be more relevant to your decision than a study published in a top-tier journal from a very different context. Understanding those differences can guard us against a simplistic evidence is only good if it is at the top of the pyramid mentality. The best available evidence is a function of level, which is the hierarchy of evidence, the quality, and relevance. We'll keep coming back to this triad in this video. In fact, holding that in mind as a mantra, high on the hierarchy does not always mean high quality or high applicability or usefulness for you. By contrast, evidence lower on the hierarchy may still inform your decision if used carefully and if the only evidence we have, especially in leadership contexts, while randomized control trials are very rare. Now think about a decision you recently made or a recommendation you give in your organization. Did you consider where your supporting evidence come from on the hierarchy of evidence? Did you evaluate how sound that evidence was or whether it truly fits your situation? Take a moment to write down which of the three, hierarchy, quality, and relevance of the evidence, you tend to pay most attention to currently. Which do you perhaps neglect? Keep those thoughts in mind as we proceed. You'll see why balancing all three aspects is important for evidence-informed decision-making as leadership practitioners and researchers. Now that we have the basic idea, let's examine the classic evidence pyramid in detail. This pyramid is a foundational concept in evidence-based practice. It visually represents the hierarchy of evidence, with the most robust evidence at the top and the least robust at the bottom. Although it was originally devised for clinical research, it's often used in fields like education, management, and public policy to encourage a preference for stronger evidence. At the top of the pyramid, you'll usually find systematic reviews and meta-analysis. A systematic review is a rigorous examination of all relevant studies on a specific question using predefined methods to find, evaluate, and synthesize findings. A meta-analysis is a type of systematic review that statistically aggregates data from multiple studies. They sit at the top of the hierarchy because they aggregate evidence across many settings and eliminate random errors of any single study. For example, in this article titled Transformational Leadership and Performance Across Criteria and Levels, a meta-analytic review of 25 years of research. The authors synthesized data from 117 independent samples across 113 primary studies. They found that transformational leadership was positively associated with performance across individual, team, and organizational levels. Specifically, it has a stronger effect on contextual performance, for example, helping behaviors, organizational citizenship, than on task performance, and exhibited the greatest effect at the team level, followed by organizational and individual levels. Importantly, this meta-analysis also demonstrated that transformational leadership adds predictive value beyond transactional leadership for contextual and the team performance, which is known as the augmentation effect. Just below, sometimes at the equal top tier, are individual randomized control trials, RCTs. An RCT assigns participants randomly to an experimental group receiving an intervention, or a control group, which is the gold standard design for inferring causality in many fields. Randomization, if done well, helps ensure that differences observed are due to the intervention, not some pre-existing differences between groups. In medicine, an RCT may be a trial of a new drug. In the leadership context, an RCT could be a field experiment where some administrators are trained with a new coaching technique and others are not, and employee outcomes are compared. RCTs are less common in leadership research, but they do exist. For example, a randomized trial of leadership development program in large organization where some departments get the program but others serve as controls. If properly conducted, the RCT provides strong internal validity. We can be fairly confident any observed effect was caused by the intervention, not by external factors. And the classic hierarchy of evidence values this ability to support causal claims very highly. Next in the pyramid comes controlled observational studies. This includes cohort studies following two groups, one exposed to something, others not over time, or cross-control studies looking backward from outcomes to potential causes. In those research designs, participants are not randomly assigned, but researchers use statistical controls to account for differences. In leadership research, this may be a longitudinal study comparing organizations that implemented a policy versus those that did not, with an attempt to control for initial differences. Here is a case control example, studying excellent companies versus average ones, as Jim Collins did in Good to Great, which I'll critique later. You use case control to identify factors that are different, but without randomization. This is very challenging to be sure those factors caused excellence. Observational studies can hint at correlations and potential causal links, but they are more prone to biases. For example, perhaps only the most financially stable organizations chose to implement that new HR system, or the system itself is not why they perform better. Still, if done carefully with methods like regression controls and propensity score matching, observational studies can provide valuable evidence, especially when RCTs are not feasible. For example, a large survey study may find that schools with a certain leadership style have higher teacher retention. It's a useful insight, but we should treat it cautiously because other factors may be at play. Lower down on the hierarchy of evidence, we find descriptive and qualitative studies, such as case studies, ethnographies, and narrative analysis. Traditional hierarchies often lump them with case series or expert opinion. But let's differentiate. Case studies, which are detailed examinations of a single organization or a small number of cases, and qualitative research, for example, interviews, focus groups, observation-based studies, provide rich context and depth. They excel at answering how and why questions and explore new phenomena. But because they usually lack large samples or control groups, they are not intended to provide broad generalizable claims or causal confirmation. In the hierarchy of evidence for effectiveness, they rank very low. If someone says, we have a case study of our organization where a new leadership style worked wonders, that's interesting, but considered weak evidence on the hierarchy of evidence for general effectiveness. It may be a fluke or context specific. Nevertheless, qualitative evidence is extremely valuable for understanding mechanisms and meanings. Many leadership theories, like transformational leadership, were born from qualitative research before being tested quantitatively. I'll have more discussion on this point later because it's a point of contention in evidence hierarchies. At the bottom of the pyramid is expert opinions, anecdotes, and conventional wisdom. They are ideas not based on systematic study at all or based on professional experience without systematic data. In medicine, this would be a senior doctor's hunch. In our field of leadership, it may be a famous leader's advice in a book or a consultant's framework that seems right and sounds good. Those are the least reliable form of evidence in the hierarchy because they are prone to all the biases of human perception and have not been tested rigorously. For example, a prominent leadership guru or consultant may claim technique X is the secret to success. It worked for me when I was a CEO or superintendent. That's an anecdote. It sounds compelling maybe, but it ranks at the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence because it's one person's story, potentially subjected to the halo effect or nostalgia or self-promotion. Why is the pyramid shaped as it is? The implicit logic of the pyramid is about internal validity and generalizability. The higher up, the more a study can support a claim that X causes Y with confidence, thanks to methodology, and the more we'll believe the finding can apply broadly. A meta-analysis with well-done experiments, which is top tier, not only has a strong internal validity, but also covers multiple contexts, so we trust applying it to general policy. A single controlled trial, which is next tier, has high internal validity in one context. Observational studies have moderate internal validity, so any causal inference is shakier, although they may cover more real-world contexts, which raises external validity concern. Case studies and qualitative research have high contextual insight, but typically do not prove causality or generalize far. And expert opinion is completely dependent on the expert's correctness, with no systematic controls for bias. It's important to point out that this classical hierarchy carries assumptions that deserve scrutiny. One assumption is that methodological rigor for internal validity is important. Therefore, RCTs are near the top. Another assumption is that evidence that demonstrates causality in a controlled experiment is more useful than evidence that merely observes correlation or describes the context. This often aligns with a positivist view of knowledge, which seeks objective causal effect truth. The pyramid also assumes a little bit one-size-fits-all generalizability, that an RCT done anywhere, if high quality, is more credible than local informal evidence. Those assumptions have been challenged. For now, it's important to understand the hierarchy of evidence because it's deeply ingrained in how we talk about evidence. For example, if you claim something in a research paper, you may be asked, what's the evidence for that claim? Is it just a case study, or do you have meta-analysis evidence to substantiate that claim? That question is essentially asking you to position your evidence on the hierarchy of evidence. As a leader, you may notice that training programs or policies often comes with citations like a generic statement. Research shows this works. Part of being an evidence-savvy leader is to immediately evaluate what kind of evidence is being cited, where does it fall on the pyramid or the hierarchy of evidence, and thus how much confidence should we place in that piece of evidence. The classic hierarchy privileges the internal validity and causal inference. It assumes that higher tier evidence applies broadly, though in reality, context can limit that. Also, the hierarchy is about effectiveness question, what works. Different questions may flip the script. If your question is explanatory, for example, what is happening in this organization, a qualitative study may be more appropriate evidence than the RCT. So the hierarchy of evidence itself should not be followed blindly. They are a tool, not a doctrine. But as a starting point, understanding this pyramid helps you quickly evaluate the strengths of evidence. Now think of a project or initiative you've been involved with recently, perhaps implementing a new policy or choosing a new curriculum. What evidence was used to support it? Can you identify where that evidence would fall on the classic pyramid? Was it a systematic review, individual study, a few anecdotes from other organizations, or just gut feeling from leaders? Write down the type of evidence and rank it. How confident do you feel about that decision in light of the evidence? Before we move on, remember, the hierarchy of evidence is a guide to what tends to be more reliable. But in leadership and organizational context, we must also weigh the practical considerations, which is the relevance I talked about earlier. High-level evidence may not exist for every question. You won't find an RCT for every leadership tactic, and not every decision can wait for perfect evidence. The goal is to use the best we have and to be aware of the limitations. With that in mind, let's turn to some challenges we face when applying those ideas in the real world of leadership and organizational research. Moving from theory to practice, we encounter a major issue. Not all that glitters is gold in leadership research. Our field of leadership is filled with studies and writings that sound convincing and compelling. They use inspiring rhetoric, trendy words and terms, confident assertions, but are methodologically weak and even downright flawed. As scholar practitioners, we have to develop a kind of scholarly BS detectors to critically evaluate evidence before accepting it. Let me discuss two big topics here. First, the problem of rhetorically persuasive but weak evidence. I call it cliche and hype in leadership research. Think about popular leadership books, articles, even some academic papers. Have you heard claims like this? Studies have shown that companies with engaged employees outperform those without by 202%. Often a claim like this is based on a correlational study or a proprietary consulting report, not a randomized experiment, but is presented as near facts. It's catchy and it may be based on real data, but is it causal? Or could high-performance companies simply invest more in engagement? Often, it's the latter. Here is another statement. Our 5-year research project uncovered the 7 traits of highly effective leaders by interviewing 50 CEOs. The interviews and qualitative data are valuable for generating insight, but concluding definitive traits from a non-random sample of successful CEO is very risky. It likely suffers from selection bias, and there is no comparison group of less successful CEOs. However, the way it is phrased implies a scientific discovery of causal traits. One more example, implementing XYZ framework will guarantee improvement. Just look at organization Z that did it. This is essentially anecdotal evidence. It cherry picks a success story. Perhaps organization Z succeeded despite the framework or due to other factors. It's classic post hoc. It assumes because they did X and then success followed, then X caused it. Without comparative evidence or multiple cases, we don't really know. Those kind of statements are cliches in the sense that they appear frequently and often go unchallenged. In leadership and management literature, there has been a historical trend of charismatic gurus and captivating narratives. People love stories in search of excellence, but are they built on strong evidence or on rhetoric? Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, is beloved by many managers. Collins identified a set of great companies and analyzed what they had in common. His findings, like the famous level 5 leadership, get the right people on the bus, etc., became best practices in many organizations, but scholars have pointed out severe methodological issues. Collins essentially selected on the dependent variable. He took companies that were successful, great, and tried to deduce common traits without equally studying companies that did the same thing but failed. It's like identifying that all winning lottery players happen to have bought a ticket and concluding buying lottery tickets makes you a winner. Those books sound impressive, but much of the data are not valid because those sorts of data are seen through the lens of the company's success. They don't explain the company's success. They are explained by the success. When a company is doing well, commentators attribute all manners of good qualities to it, strong culture, visionary leadership. But if it fails, suddenly the same qualities are reinterpreted negatively, even nothing internally changed. In other words, a lot of evidence in leadership success literature is a rhetorical halo effect rather than rigorous analysis. So what's the result? Many best practices circulate in organizations are built on very shaky evidence. It's persuasion without validation. As scholar practitioner, it's part of your job. It's to detect those BS and call out the difference. You need to differentiate between it sounds good and it's supported by strong evidence. Here are some of the examples of cliches that should raise your critical antenna. First, guru bias. When a single authority's opinion is taken as truth, for example, according to Guru X, this is the way to lead, you should always ask what evidence that Guru's claims. Is it just their experience, which is at the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence, or did they systematically study it? Second, the glowing case study, a success story presented as proof. For example, Organization A implemented agile management and saw the organizational performance double. So the agile management causes an increase in organizational performance. Maybe Organization A was in a booming market. Maybe a new product drove profit and the agile management had little to do with it. One case proves little. We need comparative cases or broader data. Number 3, cherry-picked data, only reporting the supportive evidence and ignoring contrary cases. Perhaps a consultant tells that 10 companies they consulted all improved outcomes, but did some clients fail? Are we hearing about the success but not the failures? In research, this is similar to publication bias. Studies that show positive results get published or talked about, but negative ones don't. And number 4, over-reliance on surveys with self-reports. A lot of leadership research uses surveys. For example, self-rated leadership behavior correlated with team performance. Surveys are fine, but keep in mind common method bias, which means the same respondents rating both leader and outcomes. And that correlation can be spurious. If a paper's evidence is people who said they use X style also had high-rated teams, you should consider other explanations. Perhaps good teams makes a leader look like they're using that style rather than the leadership style causing a good team. The next one is cliche statements without details. For example, leaders should always empower employees. Studies prove empowerment is best. Well, yes, empowerment generally is positive, but context matters. Safety-critical teams may need more directive leadership sometimes. Absolute claims often signal oversimplification of evidence. The broader point here is that leadership and organizational science are social sciences. Human behavior is complex, context-dependent, and not as amenable to neat lab-style experimentation. This means we must be especially careful to demand rigor where possible and to recognize rhetoric. And the saying goes, in God we trust, all others bring data. But I like to add, bring good evidence. Otherwise, as leaders, you may fall for leadership fads that don't actually work or invest in evidence-based intervention that were never truly evidenced. Now, let me address another important issue. Where does qualitative research fit? Many of you may wonder, given the classic pyramid or hierarchy of evidence seemingly put qualitative evidence near the bottom, does that mean qualitative research is low value? The answer is no, but we have to clarify what we mean by evidence and for what purpose. Qualitative research design, for example, interviews, focus group observations, case studies, and ethnographies, is indispensable in leadership and organizational studies. It helps us understand processes, meanings, and complexities that numbers alone may miss. For example, how do employees feel during a change initiative? How does a leader's narrative shape organizational culture? Those questions are often best answered qualitatively. The hierarchy of evidence I discussed earlier was largely developed for questions of efficacy or effectiveness. Does X work? What's the effect size? Qualitative research typically addresses different kinds of questions: how something works, why it works, what context influences it, or even what is happening. It does not usually aim to produce a universally generalizable finding like intervention X causes outcome Y by Z amount. Therefore, it's a little bit an apple to orange situation to place qualitative studies in the same pyramid aimed at causal inference. However, in the early days of evidence-based practice, some advocates, especially in medicine, did dismiss qualitative evidence as low level. This has been rightfully criticized. In fields like education, management, leadership, and health services research, it became clear that epistemological assumptions are different. A positivist approach values controlled experiments above all, whereas a constructivist or interpretivist approach values context-rich understanding. Modern research-based frameworks try to integrate both. So how should we, as evidence-informed leaders, treat qualitative research? Here are a few key points. First, qualitative evidence is important for context and mechanism. If a quantitative study tells you that a leadership training program improved the performance by 10%, a qualitative follow-up may explain why. Perhaps it builds trust or changes the communication norms. If you ignore the qualitative side, you risk misapplying a program because you didn't grasp the underlying mechanism or necessary conditions. Second, qualitative studies can have rigor too, just of a different kind. They're not anecdotal free-for-all. Good qualitative research uses systematic methods, for example, coding, triangulation, and theoretical sampling to ensure credibility and transferability. There is even work on hierarchies of qualitative evidence for practice. For example, placing meta-synthesis of qualitative studies at a higher tier than single qualitative studies. So in qualitative research, some evidence is stronger, for example, multiple case comparative studies, and some is more tentative, for example, simple unusual case. And third, in the context of making evidence-based decisions, qualitative research often comes in play in evaluating relevance and applicability. Remember our triad: hierarchy of evidence, quality of evidence, and relevance of evidence. A purely quantitative top-tier study may tell you on average X works, but a qualitative study may tell you in organizations like yours, people responded to X with this concerns. That is important for adopting evidence. For example, an RCT may show a new coaching method improves leader effectiveness, which is the general evidence, but a qualitative study in some of those teams may find that it only worked when leaders had substantial administrative support, which is the contextual insight. If your situation lacks those conditions, the qualitative warning is gold. And fourth, clarifying your question. If your question is, what is the effect of this intervention? prioritize quantitative causal evidence, and the hierarchy of evidence comes in. If your question is, how do I implement this effectively? Well, why did this outcome occur? Then you may want to prioritize qualitative evidence. Often we need both. In leadership, implementing evidence-based practice often means reading both the numbers and the narratives. In the spirit of evidence-based leadership, we should not set quantitative against qualitative as enemies. Instead, we combine them. This is sometimes called mixed methods evidence. One more note on qualitative research. Because it is sometimes placed near the bottom of evidence pyramids, qualitative researchers bristle, rightly so, at the notion that their work is of no value. The key is recognizing that the hierarchy was never meant to rank the importance of all types of research in general. It was meant to rank confidence in answers to a specific kind of question. Usually it's about effectiveness of a treatment or intervention. If your research question is different, then the hierarchy shifts. For example, if the question is, what do patients value in healthcare? Qualitative focus group may be top evidence, and RCT does not even apply. Likewise, in organizational change, if the question is, how do employees perceive the new policy? Your best evidence comes from qualitative research, not an experiment. So when teaching this to practitioners, I often say, use the hierarchy of evidence when it fits your question, but don't contort every question to fit the mold of a randomized control trial. To wrap up this video, leadership research is prone to seductive but weak evidence. Always ask, who says it? Based on what method? Are there alternative explanations? Has it been replicated or just a one-off? At the same time, embrace the multiple forms of evidence, numbers for rigor, stories for insight. Now, think about a popular idea or best practice in your field that you suspect may be more hype than robust evidence. It could be a trendy leadership term, a training method, or a claim like millennials need X in the workplace. Have you ever dug into the source of that claim? Consider choosing one of those claims and make a note to yourself. Later, try to trace it to an actual study or source. Was it based on robust evidence or just consulting speak? This exercise can be eye-opening as you develop your own scholar-practitioner lens.